Okay, we're still talking about chapter 10 now. And for those of you that don't remember from the long time ago that was yesterday, this is the last day of the, say, around 6 to 11 age. And we're still talking about social and emotional development. Now, this is that time during the industry versus inferiority that I went on and on about yesterday, where they're basically learning to be something and be somebody. Now, one of the things that I do want to go over is I mentioned that they get a good sense of self concept. One of these is that they can start to use something called social comparison theory. A researcher in the 50s named Fessinger, Festinger, Fessinger. He went over social comparison theory and actually had a fascinating paper where we basically base a lot of our self concept and self worth and self esteem and all these self things on comparing ourselves with others. Because we need some sort of measure of how to tell how well we're doing. We need some sort of metric or rubric, some scale to gauge whether or not we're completely worthless in the world or even just at one specific task. And one of the ways we do this, since we're such social creatures, is by comparing ourselves with others, and they call this social comparison. Now, that alone makes a lot of sense, but he found a lot of different rules on social comparison that children are going to use as much as anything else. So, think about something that you're good at, and if this were a lecture in class, I could go ahead and ask for examples. But I'll use myself as an example. I consider myself a pretty fair archer. I enjoy doing archery, and I consider myself a fair archer. But in order to call myself a fair archer, I have to compare myself with something. I have to have some basis of saying that I'm any good at this. So I compare myself with other people. Compared to the other people I shoot with, I shoot pretty well. Um, on the other hand, my 9-year-old is also learning archery and really enjoys archery, but I don't compare myself to him. If I were to compare myself to him, I would think I would be an amazing archer because compared to me, he kind of sucks. And likewise, I would also not compare myself with people who shoot at competitions professionally. I mean, there are people who can Robin Hood every arrow. They can do amazing feats with a bow that I don't even come close to, nor do I pretend to have that level of skill. So I'm really just comparing myself with a very narrow band of people who are about my own level. Maybe a little bit under if I'm looking to feel good about myself. Maybe I'll compare myself with people a little bit better than me if I'm trying to push myself to excel. But we're still just talking about a very narrow band of people that are very similar to ourselves. And this is just kind of how social comparison works because it wouldn't work otherwise. It wouldn't give us a good gauge that's going to both have us excel and yet at the same time not feel horrible and just feel hopeless. Um, and if you think about any of the things that you consider you have a talent in, it's probably very similar. You don't compare yourself with a small child, but on the other hand, you don't compare yourself with a professional either, whether it's cooking or fixing cars or whatever talent you happen to have. And this is how social comparison theory works, and there are other rules about it as well. But so we use this as a gauge of how good we are, and it's very important for children because for children, I mentioned last time that some kids who aren't very good at this will say, I'm the best in the world at this, or they'll take 2 karate lessons and call themselves a kung fu master, because they're learning social comparison, but they're not good at it yet. And it's kind of a rough phase because the entire world is better at than they are at almost everything. I mean, kids are little larvae. They're just by and large not that good at things. Um, so with social comparison, as long as they compare themselves socially, they're going to develop this pride that is absolutely essential for giving themselves that sense of industry instead of inferiority. Um, Now on page 10, there's table 10.1. I didn't write down what page that was. And know the table really well. It's a very interesting take on moral development. Um, And I started to get into moral development a little bit a couple of days ago when I was talking about that children of certain ages, this age specifically, are starting to develop emotionally and morally to a point where they can understand that things are right and wrong because they're going to get caught for things. But they can start to get into some of the higher order moral functions of something is just inherently right or wrong because the act itself is desirable or not desirable, or maybe it's worthwhile to do this particular thing. If the classic example that they give when doing the moral reasoning is one that most of you have heard of, I'm sure, where uh, a man's wife is dying of a disease and there is a medicine that will cure her, but he doesn't have the money for the medicine. So he is trying to decide whether or not it's okay. There's a pharmacist nearby that has the medicine but is charging more than the man can afford. So he needs to decide whether or not he should break into this place, break the law, and steal the medicine to save his wife's life. And it's there's no right or wrong answer with morality. It's more about what sort of reasoning you're giving for your answer. And at this stage, typically a child will say that no, it's a bad thing. Um, uh, at the age of 5, they'll typically say no, he should do it because he wants to save his wife's life, and their reason is totally based on him. They are not considering in any way the fact that somebody else is being harmed by this. The fact that the pharmacist paid good money for this drug and now is at a loss. And at this particular age, the industry versus inferiority age, they're more saying no, it's a bad idea because it's against the law. Maybe if they look at it a little bit further, they might say, um, they might start to get into the moral development of he shouldn't do it because it's against the law and he's going to get caught for it. And even if he does save his wife's life, now he's in jail for the rest of his life. So he's basically given up. They can't get around the fact that he's going to get caught for it, that it's against the law. And of course, some people morally stay in this stage the rest of their lives. It's just how they roll. Now, at this point in their life, the children are also starting to develop peer groups. But peer groups are still based on propinquity. Now, this is a great 50-cent word. Propinquity. It is, I use it as a classic example how some scientists love to just come up with big words when there are other words that work just fine. And the other word that works just fine, of course, would be proximity. They're virtually indistinguishable as words. But propinquity is such a cute sounding word that I like to use it. Um, and so the main thing that gets children together at this point is propinquity. Uh, for example, if you have a child, he's probably not going to be best friends with somebody in Bangladesh. Why? He's not in Bangladesh. He's never going to see the kid from Bangladesh. They could have everything in common, and that doesn't matter. So essentially, they're going to hang out with other kids from the neighborhood. They're going to learn from other kids in the neighborhood. And the important part here is whether or not they have anything in common with these children is totally irrelevant to them. It's annoying if they don't have anything in common with these children, but they're still going to wind up being really good friends with them. They're going to be friends with the children in their class more than they're going to be friends with somebody outside their class, even if they would be a better friend. So this is one of those ages where the parents really have to monitor who the kid hangs out with because the kid could start hanging out with a bad group of people. And I know we like to have this artificial notion of innocence of various children's lives, but there are kids that are not as good to hang out with. I already went over the fact that a lot of different ways that you rear the child. At this point, the child is relatively socialized, and because some parents aren't necessarily, say, going to value education, they're going to then socialize the child to not value education, and that child is going to suffer in school for the rest of their lives. And so if your child then hangs out with that child, they are going to start to pick up some of those same values. They hang out at that house, they're going to be treated the same, and then being treated the same is going to have the same effects on them. So you're going to really start to see that your peer groups are going to start affecting them in a very personal and very long-lasting way at this point. And they're going to be based on the area that you live in and the friends that they have. So it makes it a little bit harder as a parent to kind of kind of feel through this particular minefield. Now, they also have different sorts of gender development. They have a much more profound level of gender development than at the early years, and they're going through the latency period in the psychosexual stages of Freud, where they're not really exploring anything sexually anymore. They're even done the genital phase. You'll notice maybe a 5-year-old will be playing with his penis all the time. Or playing with a vagina all the time, just kind of an exploratory thing. By this age, they're not really doing that anymore. Um, they're kind of between the age of physical exploration, where every kid and their mother wants to play doctor, and which is very normal, by the way. I'm not necessarily saying you should encourage it in children, but don't be frightened by it. Don't make a big deal out of it. It's a very normal, natural thing. As a matter of fact, it's relatively abnormal if a child has the opportunity and doesn't try to play doctor when they're, say, in the last stage we were talking about last week, say between the ages of 2 and 7. Because they're supposed to be curious. They're supposed to be learning about the world and learning about the fact that other people are different from them, and that this is an important part of their life. And so if they're not curious about that, that's quite problematic. Um, but they're kind of past that stage at this point. Once they hit the next stage of adolescence, they're going to be paying attention to their genitals again and interested in the genitals of everybody else, but for totally different reasons. Um, but while they don't necessarily have a lot of sexual development at this point, they do have a lot of gender development. Because, like I said, they're trying to get their self-concept, who they are as a person. And girls will have a tendency to be a lot more androgynous. And if you remember right from last time and from the text of last chapter, androgyny is more about not necessarily having no gender roles. There was a horrible Saturday Night Live skit that got really popular for some reason I will never fathom, uh, called It's Pat, where there was this person that you couldn't tell whether they were male or female, and they called this person androgynous. And what a horrible way to misuse the word. Because androgyny is when you have a lot of both masculine and feminine features. And girls, perhaps because they're socially allowed to in this particular culture, are really encouraged to be androgynous. They're encouraged to take up both masculine and feminine roles at the same time, and boys really aren't. Boys are still really shunned if they take any feminine roles whatsoever. They're told pink is a girl's color. Historically, that's very interesting because pink was a very masculine color about 100 years ago. Um, Now we know it as kind of like a girly pansy color, um, and uh, and so we have all these very cultural expectations of what a boy should be and what a girl should be, and so they try out these different things on gender development and the different sex typing, and it's very easy to encourage androgyny, which is considered very healthy. Very easy to encourage androgyny in both genders. Again, I can only use myself as an example simply because I can't call on students and ask you guys to give me examples. But I teach my son cooking, for example. I'm a guy. I'm extremely androgynous myself, so it's very easy for me to do. But as far as I'm concerned, real men cook, because real men can take care of themselves. And if you can't cook, you can't take care of yourself. You have to be able to cook. You have to be able to clean. I sew my own outfits. The Moo Cow lab coat. Obviously, I didn't go to a store and buy that. Um, and so I can teach my son all these things that are generally relatively feminine. Yet at the same time, he's also helping me renovate a house. He's tearing up floorboards today, and so he's able to learn to be both very feminine and very masculine tasks. So it's very encouraged to teach boys to do this as well, even if it's perhaps not culturally specific and culturally encouraged. It should be on a very developmental level. Because these are those critical periods where they can learn to feel competent at something or feel incompetent at something. If you clean your child's room every day and they don't get a good grasp by the time they're 11 that they feel they're competent at cleaning their room, they probably never will. And they'll just be a slob for years and years and years. And a lot of that is because you didn't teach them properly. Um, Now, with the child sexual development and the gender typing, there's a lot of concern about childhood sexual abuse. Now, one of the things that's important to notice, especially for those of you becoming nurses or social workers. Childhood sexual abuse is we're not very well educated on child sexual abuse for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's very rare. Um, and People hate this reality. I don't know why. They really they identify themselves. They want to think of the world as this dangerous place where children should be afraid every minute of the day, and it's uh, from a psychological perspective, it's a horrible thing to do. Even as a clinical perspective, it's a horrible thing to do to a child. I was reading a an article written by a woman I was researching childhood abductions and seeing just how incredibly rare they were, um, and reading an interview of a woman who had her 5-year-old daughter kidnapped and killed, and she was going through her story, and she, her daughter was playing outside, and a guy pulled up in a truck, and he used the line that people give a lot. It's kind of a classic now of I have a puppy that's lost. Can you help me find the puppy? And both children were like, I don't think we should help this guy. We don't know who he is. Even at 5, they were told to um, be a little. So they didn't do that. So he just grabbed her and threw her in the truck and drove away. Anyway, her reaction was totally irrelevant. Um, and So she was talking about this particular tragedy, and she's like, if and they're like, is there anything you'd like the parents to know? And she's like, if there's anything I would like the parents to know, it's that they should forget about me. They should ignore what happened to my child, because just because my child was abducted does not mean that your child is likely to be abducted. It has no effect whatsoever. And the worst thing I could have done to my child, my child had 5 happy years. And I don't want a parent to look at the case of my child and then raise their own child to be fearful their whole lives, because whether my child was fearful or not, there was nothing she could do about this. She might as well have been struck by lightning. There was nothing she could do, and teaching her to live in fear isn't going to help anything. No, by all means, I would encourage the parents themselves to take precautions to make sure this doesn't happen to their children, but by all means, don't spread it to the children. There's nothing they can do about it anyway. And it's actually a very good lesson, because this is incredibly rare. As a matter of fact, I realize that giving you the numbers behind these statistics is meaningless, but there is quite literally your child is 3 times more likely to be struck by lightning than to be abducted. Being abducted is incredibly rare. Um, and that's even including the fact that most abductions are from parents, parents that had a divorce that didn't quite go right, and then they abduct their child. Once you get into children abducted not by parents, the thing people are actually afraid of like some complete stranger taking and murdering their child, I think they're 10 times more likely to be struck by lightning. And how many people have you ever known have been struck by lightning? None. It's completely insignificant. So this is not something that's going to happen on a regular basis. I mean, how many precautions do you take from having your children struck by lightning on a regular basis? None. Because it's just not that statistically available. And it's the same with childhood sexual abuse. The reason, and I went over this the first week, the reason people talk about it so much is because of the accessibility heuristic. It is very easy to remember these examples. And when you're a social worker or some sort of psychologist, it's even easier to think of these, because if you're a social worker, you're investigating, say, cases of childhood abuse every day, and after 10 or 15 years, you actually see a couple of them, and man, it's so easy to remember those. Or you don't even have to see a couple, because somebody in your workplace has seen a couple of cases of abuse, and suddenly now you think that this is like a real thing and it's very common, and it isn't. Um, and to pretend that it is does great harm to both the children and the parents, and the job as a social worker or a nurse or a police officer or counselor or whatever sort of thing you're actually trying to do. The other thing that's really important to note with childhood sexual abuse is that they've done, and I mentioned this a little bit in one of the discussion forums, they've done some long-term studies on people who were abused sexually as children. And so many people hated this study, but it was experimentally very sound. They followed people who had been abused sexually and other forms of abuse, and they wanted to see how much abuse affected long-term happiness and life satisfaction and all these other ways that you would tell if somebody's basically messed up in the long term. And they've found that first of all, physical abuse does affect long-term happiness. If you are physically punching your child in the face, that affects their long-term happiness. It really affects self-esteem. It affects concepts of self-worth and self-efficacy. It really does damage children in a big way. But sexual abuse didn't. It had absolutely no effect. Now, unless it was paired with physical abuse. But again, then it's the physical abuse that has these long-term effects, not the sexual abuse. And evolutionarily speaking, this makes perfect sense, because if you have somebody trying to do physical damage to you, let's say you're, talking about, millions of years ago, our ancestors, if somebody's trying to do physical damage to them, you needed to remember that for a long time. You needed to avoid that. You needed to go through a lot of effort to make sure this never happened again. And that's very evolutionarily sound, why you would want to avoid physical abuse. But sexual abuse just means that somebody finds you attractive. And unless it's actually paired up with physical abuse, there's no evolutionary reason to avoid it. There's not going to be those natural, long-lasting reasons. Now, what they did find was they found that some people do, especially if they're told that they're supposed to, will be abused sexually, either as a child or an adult. It didn't actually matter. And then this will mess them up. They'll be haunted by it for the rest of their life. But statistically speaking, there are a lot of people that are haunted by their past, and so they just kind of cling on to one or two things that they feel bothered them. And if these people weren't sexually abused, they would have had some other childhood problem. Maybe they were bullied as a child, or maybe their parent hugged them not enough or too much or whatever. They will have blamed something else, and so these tend to be rationalizations. The exception to this could be when you're told to. One of the best things to do is to downplay. I mean, obviously, if you find out a child is being sexually abused, you try to do things to mitigate the abuse in the future. But the last thing you would want to do is encourage or even tell the child that they now have a problem, because you're just telling the child that they have a problem. And this goes this way with a lot of different things at a very clinical level. Sometimes sending a child to a clinician is one of the worst things you can possibly do, because now every week they're reminded that this happened, when, other than that, the kids just can have goldfish memory and forget all about it. It was one incident or a half a dozen incidents, and child's lives are very, very dynamic. They change all the time. And again, that's not necessarily a popular point of view, but fortunately this is science, and we don't really care what's popular. We just study what actually happens. So physical abuse, very detrimental. Sexual abuse, not really detrimental unless you force it to be. Now, the last thing that I want to cover is bullying behaviors, and this is obviously very important, something that we covered a little bit in the discussion this week. Hopefully everybody's having a good time with that discussion topic. I personally find that particular video to be very telling, because you have a lot of bullying behaviors start out during this age, but they last pretty much your entire life. And a lot of people take the attitude of kind of victim mentality, and they examine the victim of the bullying and how the bullying affects the child, and they ignore the mentality of the bully themselves. And this is actually relatively important, because let's say you're a parent and your child is being bullied. You now have to give this child advice, and most of the advice that we give them is just crap. It's just horrible, because we're not thinking about the bully in any way. We're not thinking about how the bully would react to something, or how he might be different than another kid, or more importantly, that maybe he's no different from another kid. Chances are your kid comes home crying because he's being bullied. Well, the day before, he was probably bullying some other kid and didn't even know about it. He was just making fun of his hair or something like that, and then that kid went home crying about your kid, and your kid probably never even knew he was doing it. So bullying behavior is relatively tricky in the fact that sometimes people don't know they're doing it. And as we mentioned in discussion, bullying is really, really poorly defined. It is tough to decide what is bullying and what is not bullying. And if nobody has a good concept of what these things are, it's hard to diagnose it. Um, People will get very upset about the fact that they were bullied. Yet at the same time, um, they they would do the exact same thing themselves in a different situation. Um, Maybe they would word it differently. Maybe they feel they're being bullied simply because the other person doesn't have a lot of tact or politeness. They're saying, "Yes, you look fat in that dress." They're just not saying it necessarily very well. So a lot of the bullying behavior is going to come from simple social awkwardness, and this is where the emotional competence comes into play. There are some people who are relatively immune to bullying, and that is a great thing. Um, and that is because they're very emotionally competent. They have that emotional education. They've been taught to handle these things well. Because you're going to deal with criticism every day of your life. It's the only way to deal with criticism is to, on a long-term basis, just admit that you're a loser and never try to excel. Uh, as soon as you try to excel, you're going to come across criticism. So it's a very important aspect of their lives at this point, and hopefully we'll be talking about it more during the discussion periods. Um, of both what makes things bullying and what the appropriate thing to do is for bullying. So, and like I said, we'll cover this a lot more in adolescence as well.